Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by DISA Global Solutions. Today's presentation is entitled Highlights of the 2014 International Drug Testing Survey and will be presented by Bill Current of the Current Consulting Group. Bill Current is the president and founding partner of the Current Consulting Group and the publisher of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. He is the author of 10 books on substance abuse-related issues, or substance-related issues, including the popular title, Why Drug Testing? CCG is a leading provider of drug testing policy writing services and works with companies to help them optimize their drug testing ROI. He also administers the annual drug testing industry survey in the United States, now in its 16th year. He will present the results of that survey next week at the annual conference of the Substance Abuse Program Administrators Association. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current.
Okay, well, thank you, Jessica, and it's a pleasure to be speaking on another DISA-sponsored webinar. And I think, of course, everybody on today's call is familiar with the DISA Global Solutions and the work that they do not only in the United States but throughout the world. They've been in business for over 25 years and have experience in providing employee screening services and employee wellness services, background screening, et cetera, throughout the world. And so with over 11,000 clients. And one of the things that they've started doing recently that is, I think, of interest to a lot of people is they've begun publishing an international newsletter on employee screening issues. And hopefully, today's attendees are familiar with the newsletter, but if you're not, please go to DISA.com and sign up for the international newsletter at their international page, or you can call the number that you see on the left of the screen, and they would be happy to sign you up for a subscription to this international newsletter called Global Employee Screening in the News. Couple of interesting things that we're going to talk about today. But first, let me just sort of set the stage by explaining that for the last 16 years, through our company here, the Current Consulting Group, which was formerly known as WFC and Associates, we have been conducting a survey of the drug testing industry here in the United States. And we present the results of that survey each year at the annual conference of the Substance Abuse Program Administrators Association, SAPA. And it's become quite a popular presentation at the SAPA conference. And if anybody's interested in that particular survey, just email me at bill@billcurrent.com, and I'd be happy to share the slides that we're going to use next week with you, of course, after we present them next week at SAPA. But last year, in 2013, we conducted the first international survey of drug testing trends. Now, both of these surveys tend to focus on the providers of drug testing and other employee screening services. This year in the United States, we did have quite a number of employers participate in the survey. We didn't have that with the international survey as of yet, but that is something that we plan to incorporate into the survey, the international survey, in the future. The topics that we covered in the international survey are intended to give the drug testing industry and those who use drug testing services a good idea of where the trends are headed in terms of international drug testing, whether it's lab-based services, point-of-collection services, and anything else related to it, what type of specimens are being used around the world, and how those services are being delivered. So you can imagine that it's a very challenging project, because you may deal with a service provider in one country who actually provides services in many different countries. And so that individual would be providing responses based on several different countries. And so as we go through today's presentation, you'll see that we try to make that distinction and not simply say that this is a trend globally, but to try to pinpoint which countries this trend is actually taking place in. So the nations that were represented, excuse me, in the 2014 international survey are what you see on the screen there. So there were, X number of participants in the survey, but these were the actual countries that they provide their services in. So we didn't necessarily have a provider in Estonia, for example, but we had a provider in Finland who also provides services in Estonia, and so was able to speak to drug testing trends in both countries. And that's how it worked throughout the list here. This is very similar to the list of countries that we had last year, with the exception that we did not have South American and Central American countries in this year's survey. That is something that we plan to do, but was just not part of the 2014 report. And the people, or I should say the companies that provided responses to this year's survey were asked to identify which services they provide. And so I've listed them here in the order of greatest magnitude. So the highest percentage was collections. So of those international-based companies, now let me clarify. This particular report that I'm sharing with you today does not include any data from U.S.-based drug testing and employee screening providers. We pulled all of that out separately, and we have just included here results from providers who are based in countries other than the United States, so Canada and European countries, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, but not U.S.-based companies. We do have data from the U.S.-based companies that answered questions about international trends, but that's a separate report. These are international-based companies, and they identified these 8 services here as the services that they provide. The majority of them said that they provide collection services, and then alcohol testing services, policy writing services, training for supervisors and employees, MRO services, and then it's interesting, all the way down to number 6 before you get to TPA services, which of course is the dominant part of the U.S.-based survey that we've been doing for the last 16 years. But and a lot of the companies that did participate in the international survey are what we would probably consider here in the United States to be TPAs, but they don't necessarily identify with that term. Some of them providing laboratory services, but not necessarily being a laboratory. And again, it comes down to sort of how you view or perceive what it is that your company does. So in the United States, even though a traditional third-party administrator, a company like DISA, for example, would provide laboratory services contracted through, say Quest Diagnostics, they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves at DISA to be a laboratory, although they provide laboratory services. And so I found that to be a little bit of an anomaly in the international responses, because most of the providers, from as best as I could tell in researching them, and with virtually every one of them, or we tried to research who they were and what their company was, so that we could sort of vouch for their input. We didn't want people participating in it, even though we appreciate the participation, if they weren't really in the industry. And so we didn't really find any that were actual laboratories, although there were a couple of companies that are part of laboratories. But a number of them identified laboratory services, not because they're labs, but because they provide or sell laboratory services. So these are the services. There were others, but the vast majority of percentages fell between these first 8 responses. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, these are the issues that were covered in the survey that we're going to talk about today as part of this presentation. We're going to talk about the state of drug testing outside of the United States, and then the availability and quality of lab services and collection services. Then we'll talk about POCT devices. We'll look at trends related to POCT, oral fluid, and hair. We'll look at the input from our providers when they compared urine drug testing to oral fluid and hair testing. And then we asked each of our participants to identify what they thought were the greatest challenges to the drug testing business where they're located and in the countries where they do business. And then we asked them also to predict some emerging trends. And to kind of get us started, we're going to look at some 2013 data. So these were 3 categories of questions I'm about to share with you that we did not include in the 2014 survey. So I have no new update, but I don't think much would have changed in these three categories. So as I go through them, I think you'll probably agree. So last year, as part of the very first international survey, we asked participants to share with us what they thought were the countries that were best for drug testing from their perspective as a business. And the things that factored into that based on the comments that we received from the participants last year were, if they had, laboratory services available in that country, if there were qualified collectors available in that country, if the law supported drug testing in those countries, if unions were an obstacle to drug testing in a country, etc. So we asked the question, which countries were best for drug testing? We also asked the question, which countries were worse for drug testing? And it's interesting, again, keep in mind that these are these are comments based on the results from providers who are not in the United States. These are what we would call foreign-based providers here in the U.S., okay? And I'm only sharing with you the list of the best countries for drug testing, but I have a comment for you on the worst countries for drug testing. So the United States was rated number 1 in terms of being a country where drug testing can be conducted, where there's support for it, where there are services in place, etc. And then right behind the United States, and it was very close, United Kingdom. Now that's not rating one above the other, but United States was mentioned the most often, then the United Kingdom was mentioned the most often, then Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Ireland, Canada, Singapore, Brazil, and Finland. Now, we didn't include some parts of the world in this year's survey, so we don't have data on, whether Singapore would have appeared again. We didn't ask that question. But interestingly, the United States was also rated as the worst country for drug testing. So a split there for the U.S. Now, why some considered it the worst state for drug testing, or worst country for drug testing, and some considered it the best, is not really something the data tells us, except probably to some extent, and this is borne out in this year's study and some of the comments that were provided by our survey participants, is that they kind of feel like the United States is just a little too detail-oriented, that we regulate drug testing too much in the United States. And even though most of these foreign-based providers don't attempt to sell their services in the United States, they're obviously dealing with U.S.-based providers all the time, either providing collection services to a TPA here in the United States or some other service that they're providing to U.S.-based providers. And many of them felt that the United States was difficult to deal with, but they also rated the United States as the country that is best for drug testing. So a little bit of a split personality on that one, but I thought you'd find it interesting to see how they rated the best countries for drug testing last year. We also asked which markets, and we might call them industries here in the United States, were the best buyers of drug testing. So where in the workplace market do you sell drug testing the most? And just like in the United States, the number 1 industry is transportation. Now, we broke it down and gave them options. So you see oil and gas, aviation, railroad coming up there. But we also asked transportation generally, and that got the highest response. We don't ask that question every year in our U.S.-based survey, but when we have asked it in the U.S.-based survey, transportation is always number 1, which is interesting because in the 2014 U.S. survey that we're going to present next week, we also asked what percentage of your business, now again we're talking to drug testing providers, what percentage of your drug testing business is Department of Transportation drug testing versus what we might call non-mandated drug testing. And by a very large percentage, the majority of people put somewhere in the 25% range as the percentage of their business that's actually DOT. And yet, the industry that's rated the highest for buying drug testing is transportation. And so what we're looking at on the screen here are the results from the 2013 International Survey. Transportation rated number 1, and then part of the transportation industry, aviation, you see there, railroad coming up, and a little bit farther down, trucking. Trucking, 43.4% of the respondents said this was the industry that bought the most drug testing. So not number 1 by any stretch of the imagination, but in the United States, under transportation, it would be clearly number 1. under the DOT regulations of the different DOT modes here in the U.S., trucking is clear and away the number one buyer of drug testing compared to, aviation and railroad, et cetera. Also, you'll notice that oil and gas is right there at number 2. So if you take out all of the sort of general transportation and start to divide it up among the different modes of transportation, aviation, railroad, et cetera, then oil and gas looks like number 1, and it is a big part of international drug testing. In fact, at the IFDAC conference last week, the International Forum on Drug and Alcohol Testing, there was a lot of discussion about oil and gas and establishing standards, global standards, for drug testing in the oil and gas industry. And so there's a big movement towards that right now, and that was a big part of the IFDAC conference last year. Incidentally, for those of you who are interested in IFDAC, they will be holding their annual conference in 2015 in San Diego. I don't have the date in front of me, but I believe it's in San Diego, probably somewhere around the September timeframe again. So this is information from 2013. Also look at the very bottom there, manufacturing at 30%. Comes in pretty low internationally, but in the United States, manufacturing would typically be right there in the top 3. Okay, and then one more slide from last year. These are the drugs that employers typically test for according to our international survey results. Marijuana, everyone, 100% of our respondents said every drug test includes, among others, marijuana, and 100% also said opiates. So marijuana and opiates are always in the drug panel, at least according to our survey participants. Then cocaine and amphetamines right there at the top. So you're looking kind of like at the SAMHSA 5, right? The traditional 5-panel drug test. Except now go all the way to the bottom and lumping PCP and prescription drugs together, we only got 8.6%. So because PCP is part of that federal panel for drug testing, it's right up there with, in the mandated, in the DOT market, it's right up there with marijuana, right? Every marijuana test under DOT also includes a PCP test, at least for the initial screen. But after marijuana, opiates, cocaine, and amphetamines, alcohol was listed as the next most commonly drug tested for. And if you think back to the list of services that our international survey participants say that they provide, alcohol testing was right up there. I think it was number 3 or 4 among the services that they provide. Then, of course, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, a couple down from that, and then synthetics, the K2 spice, the synthetic cannabinoids, and the bath salts, the substitute cathinones right there at 21%. And we asked that question in our U.S. survey. I don't have the results of this year's survey to share with you to compare it with this 2013 international data, but we did get a lot of feedback in our U.S. survey about the synthetic drug use trend and whether or not the labs are keeping up with the changes in the chemical compounds and if the testing that is being done is effective because of that reason. Anyways, these are the drugs that are most commonly tested for in other countries outside the United States. And keep in mind that 100% for marijuana, because we're going to come back to that a little bit later in today's presentation, and then I'll try to share a little bit of data with you on the from the 2014 U.S. survey that I think is interesting to compare. Now, we did ask in this year's survey and in last year's survey for the participants to share what they felt was the state of the drug testing sales, and to some extent that would mean the state of the drug testing industry internationally, in the countries where they actually conduct their business. And so the blue bar represents the 2013 results, and the orange bar represents the 2014 results. So comparing the 2 years, you can see that there was an increase of survey participants who indicated that drug testing sales are growing substantially, greater than 5%, in the countries where they do business. And then if you scan all the way over to the right, there was also an increase among survey participants who felt like in the countries where they do business, sales are flat. They're not going down, but they're not going up either. Then in that middle category, that's where growth was between 1% and 5%. And there was a much higher percentage of survey participants in the 2013 report that felt that growth was less than 5%, but growth nonetheless. This year, it was down to 30%. And so you see between the three, 30% substantial growth, 30% slight growth, and then 40% flat, it does come out to 100%, which means that we didn't have anybody in this year's survey who felt that drug testing sales were down slightly or down substantially. So a lot of stability there, just in terms of the perception on the part of providers that drug testing sales are, for the most part, heading in the right direction. I mean, if you combine substantial and slight growth together, then 60% of our survey respondents felt that sales are up, and 40% felt that they were at least flat, but not going down. So that's a positive, at least from the perspective of the international providers that participated. Now, this is by no means scientific, okay, but the countries that were represented by the respondents who felt that sales were up more than 5% are shown here on the screen. So New Zealand, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Turkey, and Romania. So these are the countries where, now again, we didn't have a provider with a base in Estonia, but we had a participant in Finland who also provides drug testing services in, among other countries, Estonia. And so it may have been that particular provider who made this particular comment here. I'd have to go back into the data to check to be sure. But these are the countries that providers in the survey felt that their sales were up more than 5%. These are the countries where survey participants felt that their growth was up, drug testing sales are up, but between 1% and 5%. So the United Kingdom, Ghana, Indonesia, the UAE, Canada, and Austria. Now, we didn't have, there were some who felt like it was flat, and I didn't put those ones in here, but you can go back to as you look at these slides later, you can go back to the slide that showed all the countries that were part of the survey. And if they weren't on one of these two slides, then presumably they would have been rated as, sales are flat in these countries. Again, not a bad thing. When you consider some of the business trends globally sort of being on a downward trajectory, then a flat line is not that bad. But these are the two slides that we just looked at. These are countries where our survey participants who do business in these countries felt that sales were up at least between 1% and 5%, and in some cases better than 5%. Now, we also asked about point-of-collection drug testing. So let me just clarify that we're talking about the instant result, rapid result type of disposable drug testing devices. This would be where you collect a sample, and within a few minutes, that sample will give you a screening result. It wouldn't be a confirmatory type result, a screening result. We, in the old days, we used to call those on-site drug tests, and then all kinds of, various names came into play: instant testing, rapid result testing, etc. And a lot of people have sort of settled on point-of-collection testing, but it's not simply collecting a sample at the workplace, but it's also getting the result from that instant device. So just to clarify. And we've asked this question. We've also asked the question about oral fluid testing, about hair testing, because these are big issues in the United States. And we often hear from people who do business globally that these are also big issues in other countries as well. In other words, that point-of-collection testing is more popular in other countries outside the United States because they're not encumbered by the U.S. Department of Transportation regulations that don't allow POCT devices. And so we asked that question. And so we made a series of statements, and then we asked, if you agree with this statement, mark as many of these as apply. So they weren't limited to just one. So companies that use POCT still use professional collectors, about 20%. We found that to be much lower than in the United States. In the last year's U.S. survey, we asked that question also, and the percentage was closer to 80%. 80% of U.S. providers who sell POCT devices in the United States say that their clients still prefer to use professional collectors when doing POCT urine testing in particular. not scientific again. It was just based on those companies that happened to respond to last year's U.S. survey. International, though, we found the percentage to be much lower, about 20%. The quality of POCT devices is not as good as labs. Do you agree with that statement? And about half of the survey participants said they agreed with that statement. And then we asked, POCT urine is more popular than POCT oral fluid. Only about 30% responded in the affirmative on that. Prefer POCT over lab-based testing, and I've kind of abbreviated some of the statements here. So this is your clients or the people who buy drug testing from you. Prefer POCT over lab-based testing. Again, just about 20%. And the way this bar graph works is that it looks like it's just coming short of 20%, but that's as close as the bar could come to the 20% line. So it was right around 20%, 19, 20, 21%, but right in that area. So prefer POCT over lab-based testing, really just a small percentage, about 20%. Prefer lab-based testing over POCT, and then clear out to about 50%. Keeping in mind that there were other options, not everybody responded in the same way. And lots of times people provided comments, which I'm going to share some with you here in a second. And then POCT is still relatively new in the countries where I do business. Do you agree with that statement? And about 20% responded that they do. So, you know, again, from the sample that we have to work with, understanding that this is not a scientific report, we find that POCT is probably not in widespread use in most of the countries that were represented by this year's survey respondents. That lab-based testing is probably still more popular and preferred. And some of it comes down to the comments that we see here. The quality of POCT devices is not as good as lab devices. That could be a reflection of what that international provider thinks about POCT. It could be the experience that they've had with POCT devices versus another provider who maybe has had more positive experience with POCT devices. And so because it's still such a young and emerging industry outside of the United States, POCT perhaps is not as well marketed. It perhaps is not well presented by providers. Perhaps they don't see the value of it. And in fact, of course, that's still an issue in the United States as well. And I've got a little bit of data coming up. I'm gonna bring you in on a little bit of this year's U.S. survey that I haven't presented yet and give you a little sneak peek at it. Some of you are going to be at the SAPA conference next week. Just ask you to keep that to yourself for now. Anything that I may share with you that's going to be in next week's report. But here are some of the comments. So verbatim comments regarding point of collection testing devices. Available in the UK, US, or Australia, issues with cutoffs, cross-reactivity, and expiration dates are problems, according to one of our survey participants. Again, they may not be having the same experience with POCT devices that you may be having here in the United States, and so their perception of POCT may be tainted by the fact that they're getting devices that with a limited shelf life, or that are partway through a shelf life and they don't last, or that they're having trouble with the cutoffs or the cross-reactivity. Or it could be misperceptions and myths that sort of continue to exist that no one has successfully marketed against with some of these providers. In Finland, there are no POCT used in Finland for workplace drug testing. It might be very difficult to get accreditation for them in Finland. Again, a different perception based on the laws and the policies that apply to drug testing in that country. POCT testing is very popular in New Zealand for urine testing, and there are a number of on-site devices which have been verified as complying with the law in Australia and New Zealand. Very interesting. Rapid result testing is not used in workplace testing for legal reasons. However, rapid result testing is used in abuse clinics as a tool in ordinary treatment programs. And then finally, and I did have to edit this one a little bit, as you'll see here, and another one where I had to do a little bit of editing because our international brothers and sisters are maybe a little freer with their expressions. POCT or rapid testing is blank. And it wasn't a very nice word. Only laboratory results produce reliable results. And so you can see that from the perspective of that particular participant, not a very high opinion of POCT. All right. I think it's coming up next. Let's see here. Oh, a few more comments. Rapid result testing is not used in workplace testing for legal reasons. Rapid result testing is used in clinics. POCT or rapid testing, these are sort of a repeat of that one. Available, but we have not tried to import or export POCT devices. Now, here's a little sneak preview at what I'm going to present at the SAPA conference next week, just for POCT and then for oral fluid and hair testing coming up. So we asked the question, what percentage of all drug tests are point of collection tests? And so to kind of get an idea of, how big is the market right now, the market share for POCT devices. And so 4.2% of the survey respondents in the U.S. felt it was 5% or less of all drug tests. 12.6% felt it was between 5 and 10%. 9.8%, almost 10%, said it was between 10 and 15%. 21% felt it was between 15 and 20% of all drug tests. And 33.8%, almost 34%, felt that it was more than 20% of all drug tests. That's higher than what we thought it was previously. If you had asked me 2 months ago, I would have told you that POCT is probably about 15% of the total of all the drug tests that are sold in the United States. But if you combine the 21.1 and the 33.8% who felt it was 15 to 20 or more than 20%, well, now you're looking at over almost 60% felt that way. Interesting. 18% said they don't even know. And then we had a separate series of questions about the state of POCT sales, and I've only included one number. Those who said that sales were up slightly or substantially equals 42%. So in 2014, POCT sales are up among a lot of providers in the United States. Positive sign for POCT here in the U.S. International trends regarding oral fluid testing. This is another thing that we often hear about, that oral fluid testing is more popular outside the United States than it is here in the U.S. because of the DOT regulations being perceived as considered to be the gold standard. And so, again, as a provider, I recommend oral fluid testing. About 50% are trying to push oral fluid testing in the countries where they do business. Oral fluid testing is not as accurate as urine. About 20% agree with that statement. Those that use oral fluid use POCT oral fluid as instead of urine testing, much smaller percentage there. So on the POCT side, probably still what there is of it is dominated by urine testing. Those that use oral fluid tests use professional collectors, and some of these comments cut off, I apologize, but still a pretty substantial percentage. And that's one of the advantages of oral fluid testing that's really promoted in the United States. Of course, it's not part of the SAMHSA regulations yet, although SAMHSA is in the process of developing those regulations, and we'll get a pretty good update next week at the SAPA conference. But the point is that with oral fluid, the collection process is so simple to do that you don't have to use professional technicians to actually conduct that collection. And so this statement, those that use oral fluid testing still use professional collectors at about 40%, means that outside the United States, maybe they're not buying into that argument as much as perhaps here in the U.S. And outside of the workplace market here in the United States, like in criminal justice, where a parole or probation officer would have a client coming in, as they refer to him, a client coming in to be tested, they like oral fluid testing because it does away with that matching the gender of the collector with the client, the donor. It does away with having to secure bathrooms. In the criminal justice, oral fluid testing seems to be taking off. But internationally, perhaps they haven't bought into that part of the argument. Generally, employers prefer oral fluid testing over urine, is how that reads. Kind of a small percentage there, really not hitting the mark on that. And generally, employers do not like oral fluid testing, and it's still got a long ways to go in the countries, at least, that were represented by this year's survey participants. And that sort of carves out Australia, which, of course, in Australia, oral fluid testing is the dominant testing method by far. That is their preferred testing method in that country. But in many European countries, which dominate this year's survey results, you would see the opposite of that. Many countries not really yet there. Even though at the top you've got a lot of providers committed to recommending it, you're not seeing that buy-in yet, generally speaking, from the end user. So we asked the question, what percentage of all drug tests are oral fluid tests here in the United States. This will be part of next week's result presentation. 5% or less, 25%. So a third believe it's less than 5%. And between 5 and 10%, 29.5%. So that's really where the majority of providers in the United States are with oral fluid testing right now. They believe it's 10% or less of all drug tests that are sold. You still have about 10% that thought it was more than 10%, 8% that thought it was somewhere between 15 and 20. Only 2.8% thought it was more than 20. Now, these are all somewhat, influenced by the type of business a TPA or a provider is. If they're really sort of an online distributor of instant testing devices, then they're way off the scale for POCT, and it sort of skews the results. And so if we take that top one off and the bottom one off, we kind of come up with a little bit more perhaps of an accurate result. On the oral fluid side, you can see that most providers here in the U.S. feel that it's still got a ways to go. It's still a smaller percentage of the overall volume of drug tests that they sell or that they think are being sold in the United States. And then let's just close this part of today's presentation with hair testing. This again is the international result. As a provider, I recommend hair testing only about 20%. Remember, compared to 50% for oral fluid testing. Hair testing is not as accurate as urine testing. Well, only 20% there. So there's good perception, even if providers are not committed to promoting it. In some countries, you wouldn't be able to do hair testing. Generally, employers prefer hair testing, again, a very small percentage. And then the comment, generally, employers do not like hair testing, way out there again. So we saw that with oral fluid testing. We see it again here with hair testing. And that tells us that some of these, what we would consider in the U.S. to be alternative testing methods, hair and oral fluid in particular, still have a ways to go, at least in the countries represented in this year's survey. If you'd like to compare that to our U.S. results, about 35% feel that hair tests are 5% or less of all drug tests sold, and 30.9% feel it's between 5 and 10%. So it's an even bigger percentage than with oral fluid that feel it's less than 10%, less than 5%. And then a sort of a smaller percentage that think it's more than 10%, more than 15%, more than 20%. It sort of dies down there. But 37.8% felt that hair testing sales are up in 2013 compared to last year. And I think that's probably a positive sign. We didn't ask that question last year in the same way, so it'd be a little bit challenging to compare the U.S. survey results on that particular point. But 37.8% of people in the U.S. survey felt that hair testing sales are up. Okay, then we asked generally to tell us internationally how much of the market is urine versus oral fluid versus hair. And again, this was a little bit challenging because you might have one participant in the survey who's from Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, and another one who's also from Estonia, and then another one who's from, so what we did is we just picked out a sampling of them that were sort of indicative of what we saw from the whole group. And you can see that with just that one exception on the second line, everybody is at 80% or higher. Most of them are at 90% or higher for urine testing. And just that one participant representing Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Estonia felt that oral fluid was pretty high, 35%. Everybody really either didn't mention hair testing at all, or as you see on the fourth one down, felt it was less than 1%. The survey participants, it was an open-ended question, so they were allowed to type in their result. And so this was their estimate of what they felt the market share was between urine, oral fluid, and hair. It does tell us that in some countries, oral fluid has a pretty good, they've got a pretty good start, and they're making progress, as we see in that second line there. Hair testing probably not as common or popular, and there may be some legal restrictions in some countries that apply. But urine is still the dominant testing medium in the countries that are represented in today's survey. And you see at the bottom there, 95% in Canada, Ireland, Poland, the Philippines, and India. So again, this is often a reflection of what that particular provider knows and is comfortable selling and knows how to sell. And perhaps they've not been exposed to, or they don't have a very deep knowledge of, the sort of sales proposition, the value proposition of various alternative testing methods. Now, we did ask the question about laboratory services, the availability and the quality of lab services. And I'll go through these next few slides rather quickly, but from one provider who represents these countries that are shown on the screen, very little suitable lab services in all but the UK. So in the other countries where this particular provider is located, has business operations, it's a challenge to find good lab services. And we found this to be the case once you got out of most of Europe in terms of the types of availability of lab services. The second bullet, as for the lab standards and accreditation, there's a lack of knowledge of what to ask the labs to see if accredited. So blaming the employers, blaming some service providers. Many cannot actually analyze for workplace drug test samples. In a provider who represents these countries, and this is actually a combination of several participants, very few competent labs readily available in Sweden, although the next person said full service available in Sweden, and we serve, Scandinavia. Very few competent labs in Norway, a few screening labs in Finland, and to our knowledge, only one for screening and verification. Second from bottom, we use domestic laboratories in Sweden and ship sometimes, especially hair samples, outside. And I presented these verbatim. I didn't want to mess with the wording because I didn't want to change what the participant meant. The labs we use in Sweden, Norway, Turkey, France, Romania are competent and have the accreditation we request. So again, a little bit of splits there. Depends on people's perceptions and people's experiences. In New Zealand, there are 2 accredited laboratories which provide very good, competent analytical services. And then finally, not sure that the European labs use chain of custody standards. They have different drug panel configurations, and sometimes they use different cutoff levels. And so that was sort of the assessment of lab services. We also asked our participants to sort of give us a feel for collection services, the availability and quality. So sample collections can be a challenge, especially if a national is collecting from a national. Tribal and emotional pressure can be applied, right? If you're from that country and you're testing somebody from that country, sometimes the collector is an expat, but a guest in the country, and the donor is a national with influence, not ideal. We don't face that challenge in the United States. All collectors are trained, but may not get enough experience. They may not get necessary amount of practice. Good point. Sometimes only the doctors attend, and they have to train the collection officers. Again, not ideal according to that participant. In Sweden and Norway, good competence for collectors. And then another person said, we provide collection services through our own network of collectors, and collectors are sent out to conduct the collection sites on site. We heard that from a lot of participants. International collections are many times difficult, and errors can occur. It is because of low volume, and there are normally only manuals and instructions available in English. You can see where that would be an issue. Our company is also a medical center located in the center of Helsinki, and we have collection services there. And then finally, in Finland, the collectors have to be healthcare professionals by law. We also train our customers to take the samples, and I suppose customers who can qualify as healthcare professionals. There have been many collecting agents throughout New Zealand who have staff certified to conduct both urine collections and drug screening in compliance with the law. Some companies also train their own staff. Some collecting agencies also offer oral fluid specimen collection and screening services, but none of these has certification to provide this service. And then finally, we are a laboratory and provide collection services. We do not send professional technicians on site to conduct collections other than at our service sites. So in kind of a contrast to the previous statement. Then just a little bit more here, but kind of you get the idea that collections are still something that are a challenge to coordinate, and people can get trained, but maybe there's just not enough volume for them to become really expert or competent in how to do collections. And there's not enough training that's available in the languages that these individuals speak. That's a problem. We have the same issues here in the United States in some ways, where there's constant turnover of personnel at collection sites and things of that nature, and finding individuals who are actually certified can be a problem as well here in the U.S. So collections still continue to be sort of the bane of our existence, even though I have always argued that's the critical point. That's where we need to place a lot of our attention, and there are some very good professional collection services here in the United States. maybe in some countries, other countries as well, but at least from the survey responses we got, an ongoing challenge. Now, a big part of the U.S. survey that I'm going to report on next week at SAPA has to do with the legalization of marijuana. This is an issue that is sweeping across the country. 23 states plus the District of Columbia have now legalized marijuana in the U.S. for medicinal purposes. 2 states, Colorado and Washington, have legalized it for quote-unquote recreational use. And the Marijuana Policy Project predicts that possibly 4 states plus the District of Columbia will legalize marijuana in November during the midterm elections. That's Alaska, Oregon, California, Arizona, and then the District of Columbia. But when I asked that question of our international survey respondents, it just wasn't an issue. I mean, 100% of the people who participated in the survey said that's not an issue here in the countries where I do business. It's illegal. We don't think it's going to become legal, and we're not concerned about it. Except, as one person noted, the only impact that could happen in the international market is if what's happening in the United States makes its way over into Europe. And then that could be a problem. So they're watching what's happening in the U.S. very carefully, not because it's a problem yet in their countries, but if it becomes so, if the United States legalizes marijuana, then they feel that could eventually become a problem for them because the legalization movement would start focusing on other countries. And so they're dismayed, to say the least, that in the United States, the legalization of marijuana has become so popular. And I've got a whole presentation on that, and boy, I'll tell you, there's just a lot to report there. But really, not much of an issue for those who participated in the international survey. And now we're down to the last couple of parts of the survey. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function on the screen in front of you. Or if you'd like to ask me offline, email me at bill@billcurrent.com, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have on any of the results from our international survey. We asked about concerns. So from the UK, the need for appropriate confirmation services, a lack of understanding among service providers about confirmation testing. Interesting. From Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Estonia, Finland, workers' unions are still hurting our industry. And we find that to be much more of an issue in Europe and in other countries than it has been here in the United States. The unions are not very powerful when it comes to the drug testing question, although that's not true in all places and with all companies, but not something that would generally be cited as a major problem in the U.S. But in European countries, for example, it can be a very influential factor. Labor agreements. In many countries, for example, you don't have a drug testing law, but you'll have privacy laws, you'll have health codes and regulations, and you'll have labor agreements. And so the unions play a very powerful, influential role when it comes to drug testing in many European countries. Many individuals mentioned the psychoactive substances. What they were referring to there, the new ones, the synthetic cannabinoids and the substituted cathinones, bath salts, etc. They see that as a growing problem in most of the countries that participated in the survey this year. From Finland, the companies are not willing to pay so much for the analytics. Problem that we have in the United States as well is a very price-driven product. Drug testing, people are looking for the lowest price that they can find, and sometimes they don't get the best quality. In Finland, at least, by this one provider, cited that problem. I heard it from other providers in the survey as well. From New Zealand, most testing panels are not including the new designer drugs, synthetic cannabinoids, party drugs. Many employees are aware of this and are using these drugs to deliberately beat the test, so to speak. And we find that to be the case in the United States as well when it comes to synthetic cannabinoids in the workplace. And there have been reports shown that employees will switch to fake marijuana until whatever drug test period they're trying to get past, and then they'll switch back to real marijuana. In New Zealand, it's difficult to get drug testing services in global regions such as China, and I think most people would agree with that. From Austria, U.S. manufacturers for drug testing assays are too bleep, and I'll bleep out the word he used, to understand European needs for drug testing. Now, this is a provider who really is in the treatment end of things more so than workplace. For example, typical U.S. workplace positivity rates around 2%. Actually, it's higher than that according to the Quest Drug Testing Index that came out last week. And positivity rates for our samples are around 57% because they test in substitution centers, therapeutic centers in the treatment industry. And of course, you're going to have a higher percentage in the United States with treatment centers. So that 2%, not accurate for the treatment market for drug testing, but you get the point here. From Sweden, Scandinavia is still a developing market, especially Norway and Denmark. So a lot of people came back from IFDAT saying there's a lot of progress in Europe, but still a ways to go. From Sweden, unlikely that test results from other countries will have any legal significance. Excuse me. And that's a concern. Privacy laws cited by a number of people, labor agreements, as you can see there, and making sure that we're testing for the drugs that people are actually using. And that's the big challenge in the United States as well. That's why a lot of companies outside of the DO2 regs use the expanded opiate panels and things of that nature. For predictions, from the Australian oral fluid standard has been approved for updating during 2015 and will become a joint Australia-New Zealand standard. This is likely to result in an increase in oral fluid versus urine testing methodologies. Accreditation for approving oral fluid testing services will be required both for collecting agents and laboratories. Interesting. Third bullet, the mix of drugs of abuse becomes increasingly diverse and complex, and if the laboratories can provide reporting times of less than 24 hours, then there will be a move back to lab testing as opposed to POCT. But according to our results, we didn't see a big movement towards POCT, but perhaps from the perspective of that particular participant, they're losing lab business to POCT. A lot of comments about oral fluid testing. Oral fluid testing will become dominant if assay manufacturers will provide tests with meeting relevant cutoffs. Fast, cheap immunological screening tests for new psychoactive substances. We'll see if that happens. It's kind of a slowly emerging trend in the U.S., but not a wave of enthusiasm there. And then finally, I think that international guidelines for contractors within the oil and gas industry will impact drug testing internationally. I really hope it comes into play soon. And what that participant was saying is that we're seeing the oil and gas industry really get its act together when it comes to establishing standards for drug testing. And the individual is really sort of predicting that this is a trend that will spread and cover other industries, other markets as well. And that could very well be. There are standards out there. The European Workplace Drug Testing Society has standards in place for lab urine testing, for instant oral fluid, for lab oral fluid, for hair testing, etc. And some of these have been adopted in various countries. But I think most would agree that the level of detail in those guidelines would not be commensurate with what we see in the United States. So there may be more sort of guidelines, more detail in these oil and gas industry standards that are being worked on. And if so, that may provide sort of a quasi-gold standard for drug testing internationally that we sometimes look to here in the United States from the federal regulations. So those were basically the highlights of the survey. There was a lot more data that came out of the survey than what I was able to share with you in the time that we had today. But if you're interested in learning more about it, then we would invite you to contact us. And there's my other email address, bcurrent@currentconsultinggroup.com, or very simply bill@billcurrent.com. Or you can contact DISA Global Solutions. There's their phone number there. You can contact Colin Woods or Sean Stell, who both are very, very intricately involved in international drug testing. And they would be able to answer questions. If there's more that you'd like to learn about from the survey itself, please do not hesitate to let me know. And we'd be happy to include you in a future survey, either here in the United States or our international survey, and or to answer any questions that you might have or provide any information that we can be helpful with as regards to today's presentation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Bill. And on behalf of DISA Global Solutions, we hope that you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how you can access the recording. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.